All right, good evening. And thank you all for coming on this lovely, balmy night. My name is Jason Skorich, and I'm an exhibit researcher and writer here at the Discovery Center. We're here tonight to talk about the largest moonshine bust in the northern half of the state during Prohibition that took place at Stuart Lake, 11 miles northwest of Chisholm. I'm going to start by recapping the details of the raid for those of you not familiar with the event, but then we're going to take a deep dive. We're going to be pulling all of the many threads of this story, mapping the many people involved, both local and outside the area. So fair warning, there are a lot of moving pieces, and it'll take about an hour and a half, with an intermission in between so you can get a drink, use the restroom, escape if you want to. I'm a firm believer, as you'll see in the old saying, leave them wanting less. So buckle up. So let me tell you first how I first found out about the Stuart Lake bust. I think it'll give you a sense of the combination of luck, perseverance, and intuition that go into this kind of work. I first heard about a big moonshine bust in two of our oral histories, interviews with Nabi Valeri and Bruno Antonelli. They talked about a large operation near Day Lake, north of Hibbing. That turned out to be the wrong lake, but I didn't know that at the time. So how am I supposed to find out when exactly this bust happened? Remember, the West Range, everything west of Buell, went dry from late 1915. So that meant 17 and a half years of Prohibition, or roughly 6,300 daily newspapers to troll through hoping for a bite. So what did I do? I spent a useless day doing exactly that, trolling through old newspapers with no luck. Then just as I was packing up to leave the research center after a frustrating day, I remembered these file cabinets we have there. They're basically a random catch-all for articles that employees in the library run across. If they see an article in the paper related to local history, they'll photocopy, put it into a file. It's very hit or miss. I thought, I wonder if they have a file on Matt Vitala, the local Prohibition agent, because his name is synonymous with getting busted on the range. So I look. There is a Vitala file with one piece of paper in it. And it's a photocopy of a newspaper article from the 1960s. And in that article, Vitala talks about the largest bust he ever made and says, "We made our seizure on August 1st, 1931. Bingo. So that's where it started. Now another stroke of luck. Last September, I thought, I'm gonna take a ride out to this Stuart Lake. You know, I'd never been there, I'd never even heard of it. And I wanted to get a sense of the place, get the lay of the land, so I drive out there, and most of the driveways on the lakeside are gated and posted with no trespassing signs. I drive further down the road, and here's a house with some horses, and here's a pretty house that's right on the lake, basically the friendliest looking house on the lake. Now, like a lot of researchers, I'm an introvert. So the idea of cold knocking on somebody's door, someone that didn't live there 90 years ago when this happened and that probably knows nothing about it anyway, is not at all appealing. But I do it. I knock on the door and a woman about my age answers. I explain who I am, etc. And she says she's heard something about it and she thinks she has a newspaper article somewhere. So I get back to the office and I email her asking, contact me if she remembers anything else. I get a response the next day saying, I found the article, here it is. It's one of the newspaper articles I'd already seen. That's not surprising. I ask a few more questions, and she says, essentially, that's all I know, but here's my mom's number. You can call her if you want. Well, I was chasing some more promising leads at the time, but a week or two later, I thought, why not? I'll call her mom. That's Sandy Walters, and she's here tonight. I call, I say, your daughter gave me your number, and she says, my mother is 88, her twin sisters are 91, and they're ready to talk. About what? Do you know the name Louis Galatz? Yes, he's one of the guys that got arrested. That's their dad. And she ends up giving me one of the most important pieces of information in this whole investigation, but we'll come back around to that later. So let's start at the beginning, because some of you here tonight may not know anything about this event if you haven't been to the exhibit downstairs. If you haven't, you should. It's called Never Dry, and the back section is about the Stuart Lake bust, and we have a reproduction of one of the vats there. So even after this, you can take a look at it. So I'll start by recapping the bust itself as it was covered in the local newspapers. Boom. Alcohol plant raided by feds. Wisconsin liquor operators are believed to be the instigators and backers of the complete distillery discovered and raided by federal agents at a farm near Stuart Lake, 10 miles north of Hibbing, late Saturday afternoon. $30,000, that's $600,000 adjusted for inflation today, is estimated as the approximate cost of the equipment at the farm where alcohol was being distilled and distributed in gallon tins. The liquor was shipped to various Northwest points, it is believed. 6 St. Paul Prohibition agents, led by Matt Vitola, Mountain Iron, arrested 6 persons, 1 a woman, confiscated 3 automobiles, and destroyed approximately 50,000 gallons of mash in the raid. No resistance was offered by the men. Bail was set at $7,500 each. While the raid was in progress, the woman drove into the grounds. Her car stuck in the mud, and she was unable to get away before she was apprehended. She claimed to have nothing to do with the distillery and had entered the farm road by mistake, she said. In her car, officers found a treatise on how to distill alcohol and a number of test tubes. Those arrested are, and I'm going to give you their correct names, there were some aliases for a while, and where they're from. We've got Louis Sickich of Hibbing, Frank Sickich of Hibbing, Louis Galatz of Hibbing, George Potvin of Kansas City, Olive De Palma of Milwaukee, and Joseph Vani of Chicago. And the owner of the farm is Caleb Waymeyer of Hibbing. Thousands of people Sunday viewed the farmhouse and the wreckers at work tearing down the structure, which extended through 3 stories from the basement to the attic. 10 men with 3 trucks worked from 4 a.m. until dark Sunday to dismantle the distillery and had not completed the job when the day was ended. The Hibbing Auto Wrecking Company had purchased the wreckage and moved it to their place of business. Hundreds of spectators have seen the intricate pieces of machinery there today. With a capacity of 200 gallons a day for an 8-hour day, the distillery had apparently been working day and night shifts. It is believed it has been operating for over a year. Alcohol of 185 proof has been made at the plant. The perfection of the equipment is nothing short of astounding. Agents believe the erection of the plant alone must have occupied months of time. 3 separate columns of heavy copper extended from the basement to the attic. 5 10,000-gallon vats of red Washington cedar contained the 50,000 gallons of mash which were destroyed. Sacks of sugar were stacked in every available space. Boilers, like steam boilers, were run by oil. Coils ran through the 3 stills where some of the pipes were 2 1/2 inches in diameter. 5 steam pumps were estimated as being worth $350 apiece. An air compressor like those in locomotives was considered to be worth about $700. Gauges such as those for compressors, lubrication, and oil pumps were said to be worth $1,300 wholesale. To operate the oil burners, there were 6 32-gallon steel barrels of motor lubricating oil and 12 5-gallon containers. There was also about a ton of coke. Modern, complete plumbing and electric lights were installed at the farm. Mr. Waymeyer, owner of the farmhouse, claims not to have known the purpose of the renters of his property. When he discovered their activity, he was threatened if he exposed the operators, he told federal agents. This is the headline for the bust in the Virginia Daily Enterprise. We learn a few new things, which I'll summarize here. We learned that it was capable, in this account, of 250 gallons a day. They settle on 225 for an 8-hour shift, so that's 450 gallons per day, basically. It's reported to be the largest and most completely equipped manufacturing plant ever discovered north of the Twin Cities. M.L. Harney, Northwest Prohibition Administrator, here on a pleasure visit Saturday, accompanied the agents on the raid. The plant had been in operation about a month, it is believed, so we get a discrepancy of month versus a year between the 2 accounts. So we find out there are 3 28-foot alcohol columns, so 3 stills 28 feet tall inside the house. None of the liquor is believed to have been distributed locally, the entire production of the plant having been shipped by truck to Fargo, North Dakota for distribution, Vitola said. And 7 vats, each of 10,000 gallons capacity, so there were only 5 of them filled at the time of the raid, but their capacity was 70,000. 5 filled with mash. And this tells us more about the operation and how it's laid out inside the house. 4 vats and the main still were found in the basement of the log farm home, 1 boiler and 3 vats being located in an addition to the cellar. Vittula stated that 3 tons of sugar would be needed to prepare 1 vat of mash. So that's 3 tons of sugar for 1 vat, and there were 7 of them. So remember, that is 1 batch, 42,000 pounds of sugar. 420 100-pound sacks. And yeast, you sprinkle a little yeast on to ferment, 1,050 pounds of yeast, 1 batch. So here is an aerial photo from 1961, 30 years later. You can see the driveway. Let me see if I can find my pointer here. You can see the driveway to the Waymeyer farm here, and it bends around this northern part of the lake. This detail, which I'll show here, shows the house and the addition. So you can see the addition. That's where those extra boiler and 3 vats were, and the main part of the house had 4 of the vats and all 3 stills. Now, as far as I know, there are no photos in existence of this operation when it was raided or when it was being wrecked. That's surprising, considering that thousands of people went out there to look at it being wrecked and scrapped, and hundreds more viewed the remains when they were back at the Hibbing Auto Wrecking Yard. Also, Paul Aubin Sr., local photographer, was often hired to photograph these busts as evidence, but no photo has yet come to light. That's not to say it doesn't exist, we just haven't seen it yet. An amusing side note, Nabi Valeri said that several of his young friends were hired to help the junk dealer load the copper. They couldn't fit it all in the car, so one of the kids, Joe B., had to ride in the box. And on the drive back to town, Joe B. kept throwing chunks of copper off to the side of the road so that they could come back later and pick them up. So what else do we learn in upcoming days? Let's see. Well, we learn that there is a small wooden sign on the porch of the house reading Mud Lake Distilling Company. Puzzling. We learned that the words exchanged between the bootleggers and the agents reportedly consisted of, "What can we do for you?" "Nothing, but stay where you are." That, quote, "It is believed trucks carried most of the liquor to its destination, but there is some ground for a belief that a seaplane has been landing on the surface of the lake and carrying away shipments. The possibility that the distillery has been operating for some years was also given credence, and that evidently a bookkeeper had been employed to keep track of the business affairs of the industry, as complete files and books were found. Some of the notes were in shorthand, and the translating of these notes may lead to further arrests. The notes were in the form of lists and are believed to contain a list of the customers served by the distillery. And in an upper room, there were 3 beds, one of which was occupied by a man who was placed under arrest with the others. He was believed to have been a member of the night crew, as the supposition is that the distillery was working 24 hours daily. Women's dresses were found in another room, supporting the idea that a woman was connected with the business. And we also learned that, according to Matt Vittula, maximum operation of the plant would return a monthly profit of about $60,000. That is $1.2 million today. And then the coverage disappears from the papers for months, until I find out the case goes to trial. And in the meantime, the federal authorities are investigating all of the information they've accumulated, following leads, etc. And by the time this goes to federal court, the list of names has gone from this to this. I said there were a lot of moving pieces. What happened? Well, the investigators discovered that this immense operation had been going on for several years in 3 different locations, starting in Itasca County, and that had been moved in its entirety twice before it was finally busted in its final location at Stuart Lake. So this longer list indicates all of the people associated with each of those 3 incarnations, which are called, respectively, the Walker Farm, that's west of Deer River, roughly 1928 to mid-1929. The Aronson Farm, east of Deer River, from about mid-1929 to question mark. And finally, Stuart Lake / the Waymeyer Farm, north of Hibbing, busted August 1st, 1931. Now, I'll try to break down each of these incarnations of the operation and introduce you to the participants. This may be a little tedious, but it's essential to introduce you to all of the people so we know who we're talking about. Plus, we have many of the descendants here tonight of the participants in this operation. They've helped me a great deal, and I want to do justice to this for them. I've also obtained the court dockets from Duluth and the Leavenworth prison files of some of the participants. If there were ever trial transcripts, they're gone. You can imagine how much paper was used typing up each day's proceedings and how much space that would eventually take up in a pre-digitized world. So this moonshine operation was located on the Walker Farm, west of Deer River first, on Highway 46 today. So here's a modern map overlaid with the period plat map to give you a sense of where that would be. So you basically go out of Deer River west and you take 46 a little bit, and there it is. So I've broken this list of those indicted here up into groups that I'll tackle individually. So how did this operation start? Locally, with these two guys, Jack Green and Dr. Delbert Dumas. Jack Green, alias Jack Gould, was a Russian Jew from Kishinev, Russia, who came to the United States in 1908, no doubt escaping the horrible pogroms in his hometown, one in 1905 and an earlier one in 1903 called the Kishinev Massacre. He settled in Chicago. According to the parole report in his Leavenworth prison file, in the latter part of 1928, Jack Green, alias Jack Gould, came to Dr. Dumas from Chicago, presenting a letter of introduction from an old friend of the doctor's. Arrangements were made with Dr. Dumas for the installation of a large distillery on the Walker Farm in Itasca County, Minnesota. It was operated by several men who were gotten together by defendant Jack Green. So he's the messenger from Chicago who initiates the distillery with Dr. Dumas. And he gets together the crew to build and operate the still. Who's the old friend? Well, we may never know, but as we'll see with Dr. Dumas, his friends tend to be unsavory characters. Dr. Delbert Dumas is born in Waterville near Mankato and grows up in the Twin Cities. His first run-in with the law that I can find is as an 11-year-old thief stealing eyeglasses from a local jewelry store. He goes to med school in Chicago and post-grad at the University of Minnesota. This is his U of M photo from 1902. He practices in the Twin Cities for a while, moves to Foley and becomes the coroner of Benton County before moving to Cass Lake and becoming mayor there, fighting hard to keep the local saloons open when prohibition advocates like Pussyfoot Johnson try to enforce treaty regulations. Then he really starts to shine. In October 1911, as a physician and the mayor of Cass Lake, he's tried and found guilty of attempted arson of the post office in Pulaski, Minnesota on June 16, 1911. Dumas does not do the dirty work himself, a pattern which he will continue to follow. He hires others to do it for him. In this case, two guys named Martin Behan and Mike Davis. The idea was to break into the small town store that also housed the post office, rob the place, blow the safe, and then burn it down to destroy the evidence. After his arrest, blasting caps and fuses are found in his office safe. In November of that year, he's accused of another arson in Black Duck, Minnesota. He's later cleared of this charge due to lack of evidence. In September 1912, he's finally sentenced to 3.5 years at Stillwater Prison for attempted arson at the post office. He is released in 1913 after serving 13 months. He's back practicing medicine. He's also lost his hair since 1902. And now, 15 years later, in 1928, he's helping set up an immense distillery at the Walker Farm. Dumas is the type of educated, smooth-talking person that always thinks he can beat the rap. He's the only one arrested for the Northern Minnesota bootlegging ring who pleads not guilty and makes them give him a full trial. The only witness for the defense is himself, hoping his smooth tongue will save him. He gets convicted and gets the heaviest sentence of anyone connected to this moonshine ring, 3.5 years in Leavenworth prison and a $2,500 fine. But being the slippery man he never serves a single day in prison. How? Well, when he's convicted, he gets a stay of sentence because of his supposedly precarious health. They have to check out his health. That delay leads to another delay, and before you know it, he's able to bargain down to $1,000 fine and no jail time. That's one slippery fella. Back to the Walker Farm, Dr. Dumas likely approached Andy Walker. He was the owner of the farm and asked to rent his farm and barn. Walker agreed, and on October 13th, 1928, Dr. Dumas pays local well driller John Schultz to drill a well on the Walker farm. As you can imagine, you need a lot of water for an operation of this size. Schultz gets paid $466 to drill the well and a $100 bonus, or a $200 bonus if he completes it before October 23rd. Someone's in a rush to get going. Back to the map. Each of these operations had locals working at them. In this case, that's Andy Walker, the owner of the farm, and Ben Peterson, another local farmer looking, no doubt, to make some extra money. In addition to Jack Green, we've got three other guys we know are from Chicago: Joseph Vanni, James Vanni, and Emilio Vanni. They're all brothers. I'm going to skip Emilio Vanni for now and focus on his two siblings. So this Leavenworth mugshot for James Vanni is from a later bootlegging conviction in Chicago. Although indicted here, he doesn't get arrested or prosecuted in connection with the Walker farm near Deer River. We find out through his 1936 Leavenworth file that he has always been a sheet metal pattern maker and drafter, and was thus employed when arrested. He later studies welding and plumbing, so that gives you some idea of his role in setting up the Walker farm. Is this starting to feel like one of those heist movies where they gather up all the people with their special skill sets for the job? It's kind of like that. Let's look at James Vanni's brother, Joe. He's indicted in connection with all three incarnations of this operation: Walker, Aronson, and Stuart Lake. Why? Well, because according to his prison file, defendant Joseph Vanni was the foreman of the distillery at Stuart Lake. So he's probably overseeing the operations. And in 1936, he gets nabbed with brother James and serves a second stint in Leavenworth. So he's back again a couple years later. So back to our list: Rocco, Joe, Big Joe, Dave, Tony. We'll never know who they are. They didn't even know at the time. This is all they had, right? They're likely people from outside of the area, or even possibly locals who worked at or checked up on the distillery. They just don't have enough information to make any determination. So that leaves Mike Knezevich and Arthur Hagland of Hibbing. Mike Knezevich is indicted in connection with all three incarnations of this operation, and Art Hagland with two. Some of you may know who they are. Mike Knezevich started a business called Mike Knezevich's Dray that later became Hibbing Van and Transfer. And Art Hagland became his partner. They were delivering sugar, yeast, and coal to all three operations. The Stuart Lake guys called Knezevich Sugar Mike. Art Hagland, one of the partners, later testified in court at the trial of Dr. Dumas. Here's an period ad from a couple, I think this is right around the time of the raid. I found this in one of the Chisholm newspapers. According to the Duluth Herald, Arthur Hagland, partner in the Hibbing Van and Transfer, testified that he hauled sugar regularly to the Walker plant, averaging about 300 sacks of 100 pounds every week. This approximates 15 tons, he said. Here's another picture of Mike Knezevich that I got from his youngest son, Mike Jr., who lives in Nebraska. This is Mike with one of his Hibbing Van and Transfer trucks that were hauling the sugar, yeast, and coal to the Walker, Aronson, and Waymeyer farms at night, according to Bruno Antonelli, at night in order to avoid suspicion. Mike Knezevich Jr. didn't know anything about this, so this is part of the fun of this. You get to tell people some of their own family history. Neither Knezevich nor Hagland were prosecuted. Okay? In part because Hagland testified in the Dumas trial, and because they were not directly involved with the manufacturing. They didn't go after them. So who finally does time for this phase of the operation? Most of the locals are let off fairly easily, partly because this operation happened a few years earlier, and partly because they've caught the Stuart Lake guys already red-handed and they've gotten the brunt of the punishment. So Knezevich and Hagland, as I said, are dismissed. Ben Peterson, the local farmer, gets 1 year and a day at Leavenworth, but it's suspended, and he's given 2 years parole. Andy Walker, the owner of the farm, has his sentence continued, and he's given 2 years parole. Jack Green, who originally approached Dr. Dumas, as we heard, gets 1 year and 1 day at Leavenworth. That's his mugshot. Joseph Vanni, as foreman, gets 2 years in Leavenworth. Emilio and James Vanni get indicted, but they're never arrested or prosecuted. But the doctor, as I said, gets the stiffest sentence, 3.5 years at Leavenworth, $2,500 fine, and he doesn't serve a day. So probably to avoid suspicion, By mid-1929, this whole operation is relocated and rebuilt again in a barn on the Aronson farm. The Aronson farm was located several miles southeast of Deer River on what is now County Road 11. Here's another modern map overlay to help you out. So basically you're going west out of Grand Rapids and you take a left onto 11 and it's a little ways down that road. I should say that none of the structures at the Walker and Aronson barns nor the Stuart Lake house survive today. Back to our list, there are a few familiar names here, right? We see Joseph Vani, the foreman, and Knezevich and Haglund, who are hauling sugar, yeast, and coal, and apparently, as Art Haglund testified, helping to move the operation from the Walker farm to its next location. So I'm going to skip over Felix Valley, but I'll mention him again later, and I'll get to Louis Sikich when we get to Stuart Lake. And I haven't been able to discover who Lugene Lamantio is, but he was never arrested in connection with this, so they didn't know either. So that leaves the Gertons and Mike De Palma here for new names. So let's look at the Gertons and who likely brought them into the operation. I got this family information from Tom Gibbons, a Gerton descendant. The four Gertons indicted here are Paul Gerton Sr. and his three sons, Henry, Leo, and Paul Jr. So Paul Sr. is not pictured there. There are the three sons. Paul Sr. was born near St. Peter, Minnesota, and he was a farm machinery salesman who bought quantities of farmland in North Dakota and the Crookston area before World War I. But the war years and those immediately following brought a host of problems. There were price drops for wheat, there was a drought from 1917 to 1920, skyrocketing property taxes. So the Gertons were no doubt affected by some of this, and by 1925 they had divested themselves of their farm property and moved to White Oak Point near Deer River. And like many others, they were probably lured in by the hope of some easier money and moonshine. I should also say that until recently, the Gerton descendants didn't seem to know anything about this moonshining operation either. So who brought them in? Well, if you play ball, you better listen to your coach. So this is the 1925 Deer River baseball team. Here are the Gerton brothers and their coach, Dr. Delbert Dumas. So that leaves from our list Mike De Palma, alias James Troy. He was born in Milwaukee, and it seems that he took up violating prohibition laws as soon as they were passed. His first liquor arrest is in 1921, and he has another one in 1925. But searching through old newspapers, this is the one that stands out. I'm going to skim this article to give you the flavor of what happened. The largest still yet found in Wisconsin was in the possession of prohibition agents today after a running gun battle with 7 men who attempted to prevent them from confiscating it. On a farm about 4 miles northwest of Kilbourne, 7 men, including Mike De Palma, all of whom were thought to have been imported by bootleg interests operating the still, were captured after they attempted to run from a barn into an open field in back of it. In addition to a fast truck, a coupe, and an automobile loaded with 1,400 gallons of alcohol, equipment found in the barn included 2 boilers used to run the stills, 2 stills, one of 1,000 gallons capacity, the other of 100 gallons, and 11 vats of 5,000 gallons each in the basement. All vats were filled except for one with mash. The distillery was so distinctly camouflaged that even its chimney was concealed beneath wallboards. The fact that 25 to 30 flashlights were found scattered in sections of the barn led prohibition agents to believe that the still had been operated at night. The agents estimated that the still could turn out about 1,000 gallons a day. Pretty comparable to Stuart Lake, isn't it? It sounds really familiar. Mike De Palma set up and supervised this big still near Kilbourne. And according to his parole report, he plays a similar role in Minnesota at the Aronson farm and Stuart Lake. They say, quote, Mike De Palma was one of the individuals who made arrangements and carried on the business transactions in connection with the operation of the distillery. So this Wisconsin bust turns into a fiasco of trials, culminating in the crooked local sheriff being tried for brutally murdering the district attorney in front of his wife. It's amazing. I didn't have a chance to go into it, but it's amazing. And if you look at the timeline, you'll see that while Mike De Palma was awaiting sentence for this Wisconsin operation and testifying in 3 separate trials, he's over in Minnesota helping set up the distillery at the Aronson farm near Deer River. And he gets out of prison in Milwaukee in October 1930, and a few months later, he's living at the Android Hotel in Hibbing and working at Stuart Lake. So who finally goes to prison for the Aronson farm? Well, Mike De Palma gets 1 year and 1 day at Leavenworth. And as mentioned, Joseph Vani, for participating in all three, gets 2 years at Leavenworth. Felix Valley is never arrested. Eugene Lamantio is never arrested. Knezevich and Hagelin not prosecuted. The Gertons. Leo is sentenced to 3 years at Leavenworth. That's suspended, and he's placed on probation for 5 years. Paul Sr. gets 6 months in the Itasca County Jail, and Henry and Paul Jr. are not prosecuted. So that takes care of the Walker and Aronson farms, the first two incarnations of this large operation. Now let's circle back to Stuart Lake. No documentation exists to show when the distillery was moved to Stuart Lake or how long it operated there. But I did some digging, and I found in census records that Jack Green of Chicago, who we saw, had moved his wife and daughter to Hibbing by April of 1930, 15 months before Stuart. So I'd say that well over a year is a safe bet. They were also living at the Androy Hotel. Incidentally, who's on the census line right below them in the Androy? Pearl Waymeyer, schoolteacher daughter of Caleb Waymeyer, owner of the Stuart Lake House. So these are the people connected with Stuart Lake. Okay, we got this new list, few names we've already heard and a few new ones. So here's a modern map overlay if you want to know where Stuart Lake is. You take Highway 5, let's see, play my clicker here. Highway 5 out of Chisholm, and this is a left turn on 81, which I believe is Connors Road, and you take a left here on 710, which is Powers Road, and there we are. So for the outsiders in this list, we've covered De Palma and Vani with the Walker and Aronson farms. So our new additions are Olive De Palma and George Potvin. For the locals, in addition to those arrested in the raid itself and mentioned in the newspapers, they've added Knezevich, remember he's not prosecuted, Caleb Waymeyer, owner of the farmhouse, and a Nick Berklisich. There are also two unknowns, Louis, who we'll never know because they didn't know, and John Stolsky. The only John Stolsky I can find is from Hennepin County, and I can't firmly tie him to any of this yet, so I'll leave him out. Louis Galatz. This is young Louis' wedding photo. Louis Galatz was from Gospic, Croatia, and was raised by his grandparents. He left at 13 with his cousin and walked to Germany. He left Germany on the Lusitania and joined his father George, who was already in Hibbing, and he had 6 brothers and sisters. Just before going to work at the Stuart Lake operation, Louis was employed by the Shubat Company, driving bus. He also worked for Mike Knezevich at Hibbing Van and Transfer. But he had a growing family. He would eventually have 13 children. At this time, he had 4, including a pair of 4-month-old twins, who I was lucky enough to talk to. The need to provide for his family and the lure of moonshine money in the midst of the Great Depression pulled him into working at the Stuart Lake Distillery. According to his parole report, Louis' role was that he hauled coke to the distillery and was to receive $5 per trip. Louis Galatz was sentenced to a year and a day in Leavenworth Prison. Frank Sikich. Frank Sikich's youngest daughter is here tonight as well. He was born on March 3rd, 1910 in Portland, Oregon. He moved to the range with his family in the early 1920s and sadly loses his father shortly thereafter in 1922. He catches pneumonia while building the family's new house. Frank is quite young, only 21 at the time of the raid, and because of his age, he's sentenced to 2 years at a different prison, the Chillicothe Industrial Reformatory in Chillicothe, Ohio, a former military barracks at this time. And that's his inmate number. Louis Sikich, this is one of only 2 known photos of Louis Sikich. He was born in 1894 at Gračac, Lika, in what is now Croatia. He arrived in the U.S. in 1913, and at the time of his arrest, his parents were still living in the old country, although his father Joseph had been in the United States at one time. Louis' main job was working in the mines. Sadly, in 1936, 5 years after this, he would die in an accident at the Sargent Underground mine. According to his parole report, Louis Sikich was a helper around the distillery at both the Aronson and Stuart Lake operations. And his sentence, 14 months, Leavenworth Prison. Nick Berklisich. Although indicted, Nick Berklisich was never arrested or prosecuted. He was 19 at the time of the Stuart Lake raid. A bright young man, he apparently finished high school a year early because his yearbook has the following rhyme. Nicky brings the dumb to tears. He got his diploma in 3 years. Maybe they didn't have enough information to warrant arrest, or maybe this was a case of we don't want to sully this bright young man's future. So Nick went on to college at the U of M, and he served in World War II. He also served as executive secretary for the Hibbing Chamber of Commerce. And by the time he died in 1961, he had apparently changed his name to Nick Burke and was buried at Fort Snelling. I suspect that his father and his uncle may have also been involved at Stuart Lake, but I don't have time to go into that right now. That's another tangent. I literally just discovered this 2 nights ago, so I don't stop. So this was, yeah. So we're going to go to Caleb Waymeyer. He was the owner of the Stuart Lake house where this happened, and he joins that long line of local farmers who plead ignorance of why shady people would want to rent their farm. So this is the Stuart Lake house, 1982. If you've seen the exhibit downstairs, you may remember the context for this photo. For the rest of you, we'll get to it later. For his connection in the moonshine operation, he's given a 1-year sentence at Leavenworth, which is suspended, so he's given 5 years probation and a $500 fine. Waymeyer's immediate family line dies out. I was trying to find someone connected to him. His son Ernest, a World War I veteran, dies at a young age. His daughter Pearl, who I've just mentioned, is a local spinster teacher who marries in her 40s but doesn't have any children, and Caleb Waymeyer himself dies in 1940. So the new outsiders at Stuart Lake are George Potvin of Kansas City and Olive DePalma of Milwaukee, the one woman arrested. Let's touch on her briefly. She's the wife of Mike DePalma. Okay? They married in 1922. Like most women of the era, she got off a lot easier than the men here. In this case, she's out on bail in a week, and her bail is $1,000 compared to $2,500, $3,500 for the men when they were taken down. And she is the only one arrested at the scene of the bust not to be prosecuted, even though she drives up to the scene with her car filled with test tubes and a pamphlet on distilling, and her clothes are hung up in one of the bedrooms. So what's she doing here? Because I remember, maybe you don't, because it's a lot of information. Mike DePalma isn't arrested at Stuart Lake. He's tied to it, but he's not arrested there. He's not one of the people in the newspaper. So why is he leaving her alone with these possibly unsavory characters? Well, I did some ancestry work, and it turns out that her maiden name was Olive Potvin. She's the sister of George Potvin. So it's a family affair. And we're going to look at George now. So he comes from Kansas City, Missouri. He's a World War I Navy veteran whose father committed suicide when George was 20. His record seems fairly clean, surprisingly enough, until this, 10 months before Stuart Lake. Sounds a lot like his brother-in-law Mike DePalma's big operation at Kilbourne, doesn't it? So among those arrested in this raid are Potvin and James Vonnie of Chicago. Remember his name? He was connected to the Walker Farm. Later arrested in connection is Felix Valley. Remember that name? He was indicted and never arrested in connection with the Aronson Farm. So I hope you see that these same people keep showing up in different configurations in the time leading up to the Stuart Lake bust. So I'm going to skim this article again. Does this sound familiar? Federal agents swooped down on the barn and arrested Brooks, Vonnie, and Solarski, who were operating the still. 8 large vats containing 72,000 gallons of mash were destroyed. 2 huge stills built from the basement to the roof were also smashed. These were copper column plants capable of distilling 140 gallons of 190 proof alcohol per hour. One column was 24 feet high, the other was 27 feet high. Okay, we're close. The agents found about 15,000 gallons of alcohol on hand. This was destroyed, along with a large quantity of 1-gallon containers in which the finished alcohol was being stored. 10 tons of sugar were destroyed by the agents. While they were destroying the equipment, a truck operated by Potvin and Borman drove up. On the truck were 3 more tons of sugar and yeast. This was also confiscated and the pair arrested. The same day, the Menasha record in Wisconsin says that the agents credited the huge plant to Chicago liquor operators. So in George Potvin's Stuart Lake parole report, let's see, it says, George Potvin was the cooker. That's his role. So for his involvement at Stuart Lake, 10 months after this huge Wisconsin bust I just mentioned, Potvin is sentenced to 1 year and a day at Leavenworth. And since we've been talking about these local men sent to Leavenworth prison, I'd like to say something about the conditions at Leavenworth when they arrived, because we've got descendants here of these people, and a lot of these guys didn't talk about this. So 2 words suffice: dangerous and overcrowded. Dangerous because up until Alcatraz was completed in 1934, Leavenworth was where they sent the worst of the worst. Overcrowded because Prohibition and later the Great Depression placed an enormous strain on prisons. Leavenworth was built to house 1,500 inmates, but through most of the 1920s and into the 1930s, they housed 3,000 to 4,500. You actually had inmates sleeping in cells in shifts like range boarding houses. So one person would leave the bed and the other one would go right into the cell. So it's a pressure cooker of some of the worst criminals in the country, taking the violence that's splashed all over the newspaper headlines and cramming them into an overcrowded environment. Also, at the very moment the Stuart Lake men are being sentenced in Duluth, maybe the most elaborate escape in Leavenworth prison history is taking place. There's a book on this by a retired federal prison guard, Kenneth Lemaster, that I was looking at. On December 11th, 1931, while they're at trial in Duluth, 7 men, 5 of whom were members of the Al Spencer gang, equipped with smuggled weapons, including 6 guns, 17 sticks of dynamite, a box of 100 blasting caps, and 100 feet of fuse, managed to kidnap the warden and several other hostages, make their way out of the main gate, and out of the prison. An elaborate manhunt starts almost immediately, and the inmates get separated into 2 groups. Citizens are held up at gunpoint, hostages are taken, cars are buried on muddy roads, the warden is shot but survives. 3 of the 7 are penned up in a farmhouse, which is then surrounded by between 500 and 1,000 people, made up of citizens, this posse of prison employees and soldiers. A gunfight ensues lasting hours, with thousands of rounds being pumped into the house. The owner of the house, held hostage, manages to escape, and finally, after several minutes with no shots fired from inside, they storm the house and find that the prisoners have killed themselves and are lying in a pool of blood. Then it gets ghoulish as the onlookers storm the house and scavenge for souvenirs, including dipping their handkerchiefs in the blood of the prisoners. As if that timing wasn't enough of a coincidence, one of the 7 escapees in that prison break, Tom Underwood, was serving 25 years for kidnapping and beating a mail clerk in Hibbing in 1926. When he was recaptured and returned to prison, he handed the guard a stick of dynamite and said, "Guess I won't be needing this anymore." So when those sentenced from this moonshining ring that I'm talking about arrive at Leavenworth, the environment is more tense than ever, with inmates going on strike, a full-scale investigation of how this escape happened underway. That's what they're walking into. Quite a shock, no doubt. So, okay, I've laid all the groundwork. Now the fun starts. But first, I'd like to give you 5 minutes or so, use the restroom, get a drink. Out in the park there is still beer. All right, we're going to start back up here. So if people want to sit down, I'm going to start right in. So as promised, this is where the fun detective work comes in. So let's talk about a third group, the Invisibles. So these are the people who are connected to this operation, but are below the radar. So I may seem to veer off topic at times here, but trust me, I'll bring it back around. So during Prohibition on the range, there seemed to be 2 distinct eras of bootlegging. One of the leaders of the first generation was Paul Morris of Hibbing. Paul Morris, we have some Morrises here probably, or some related to Morrises. There are 3 different branches of Morrises I've found, and it's utterly impossible to do the genealogy, but that's a side note. So Paul Morris was a pioneer saloon operator and one of the pioneer operators of a bus line, the Morris and Morris bus line. There's Paul. It was one of the lines that was folded into what would later become Greyhound. So during early Prohibition, Morris had a close relationship with Hibbing Mayor Vic Power that allowed him to operate more freely than many others. In an unhinged New Year's Day 1922 editorial, introduced to me by Aaron Brown here, bluntly entitled, "Hibbing Police Handicapped in Efforts to Clean Out Bohunk Peddlers Who Deal Out White Death. Publicity may help eliminate moonshine menace." Happy New Year. This is an editorial. Claude Atkinson, editor of the Hibbing Daily News and the Masaba Or, refers in this article, he's naming names left, right, and center, and he refers to Paul Morris as the king rum runner of the county. He says that Paul Morris has been, quote, showing the federal authorities and others the direction he desires them to follow for several years, unquote. At one point, Morris moves to Superior, Wisconsin to further his interests and the interests of those he's connected to. This is a letter of introduction on Paul Morris's behalf from Hibbing Mayor Vic Power to the mayor of Superior, saying, hey, here's my buddy Paul Morris, help him out. In 1920, Morris opens a resort near Iron River, Wisconsin called the Deep River Resort that very likely had a bootlegging component. But his fortunes wax and wane. People in the know said that he made and lost millions of dollars several times over. First in 1913 and again when the market crashed in 1929. And by the time of Stuart Lake, Morris is essentially washed up and living elsewhere in Wisconsin, away from his family in Hibbing. He later moves back to the range and for years operates a bar in Buell. Another pair of pioneer saloon operators on the range were George Bassich and John Mazeran. George Bassich started in the range bar business in about 1910, and in 1912 he transfers his license to John Mazeran. Bassich then moves to Duluth to operate a saloon there. Then around 1917, 1918, he moves to a small town right across the border into Wisconsin, to a village created to serve the workers of the steel plant in nearby Gary at the edge of Duluth called Oliver. And the town is wild. It's a town that, as Duluth and Superior flip-flop between wet and dry in the days before national prohibition, serves as a hub for all thirsty drinkers from Superior, from the steel mills, and from those who want to cross over from Duluth. As I say, it's wild. Think an amped-up version of Buell when it was on the edge of dry territory. To give you a sense of how wild Oliver was, George Bassich's son's first memory is this, quote, I remember when I was a little kid, my dad took me up to the Palace Bar, and here was this woman prostitute that the guy had knocked through the second floor window from a bedroom, and down she fell on a pile of glass. I will never forget it. That was quite a scene for a 3-year-old boy. It was really a tough, tough town, unquote. So there you go. Nothing romantic about that. George Bassich starts bartending in Oliver, and it's not long before he, with several local aldermen as investors, opens his own bar, the Palomar. And it's successful enough that in this boom moment, he's making about $30,000 a month. That's $60,000 or $600,000 today, a month. And he starts buying up real estate in the Twin Ports and in the Twin Cities. He eventually moves to St. Paul and moves his family into a huge 26-room mansion in the, at that time, sparsely settled area of Highland Park. He also creates a company with John Mazeran called the Seaway Company to buy and sell land that might become valuable if the St. Lawrence Seaway is opened to the Twin Ports. That's a whole other crooked story. So I was trying to find a way to connect George Bassich and his partner John Mazeran to the range bootlegging operations, thinking that these pioneer saloon owners might have known each other. In researching George Bassich, I found out about his son, who I mentioned a moment ago, John Bassich. In the Minneapolis of the 1950s, John was known as Johnny Rex, or the King of Skid Row. He followed, in a sense, in his father's footsteps. He owned liquor stores, a bar, and several flop houses in the Bowery area of Minneapolis. Years ago, James Schiffer, a Twin Cities journalist, found John Bassich after seeing photographs and film that he had shot of this time, and eventually Schiffer wrote a book called The King of Skid Row, and a documentary was created based on the book. Where the hell am I going with this, you might ask? Well, I contacted James Schiffer, asking what other information he might have on John's father, George, other than what he'd included in his book. At first, it didn't seem like there was much. I asked John if John had ever done any oral history interviews or anything like that. Schiffer said, quote, Jason, I think I can do you one better. While looking through my book notes, I came across John's memoir, which he dictated to someone about 25 years ago. He talks about George at length. I'll scan it in and send it to you. Fabulous. Now remember, I'm trying to somehow connect George Bassich to bootlegging on the range. A few pages in, John talks about his dad leaving the old country because George, as a bookkeeper, was cutting paychecks for people that were deceased and had to leave the country in order to avoid prosecution. And here's what he says next. He said, the colonel knew my dad, and he said, you better go to the United States. So he took a pal with. I think his name was Paul Morris or something like that. What are the odds? Not just that, but they're both involved in the pioneer bus lines that I mentioned earlier. It turns out that Paul Morris is George Bassage's best friend and John Bassage's godfather. But it gets even more exciting. Not only were Bassage and Morris close friends, but Bassage was helping Morris distribute moonshine. Let's look at another anecdote from John Bassage's colorful childhood from about the early to mid-1920s. Quote, "I never forget when my dad lived in Highland Park and his best friend was living in Hibbing, Minnesota. You couldn't move on the range unless he gave the okay. He was the most powerful man there. I won't mention his name, but he was my godfather." I connected the dots elsewhere, and it's Paul Morris. A truck came into our place there in Highland Park. There were only 13 families at that time living in Highland Park, so we were like living out in the woods. This big truck, about 8 feet high, wooden sides, drove up, and it had these tin cans full of 100 proof alcohol that were being shipped by this friend of my dad's. And then they got a tip we were going to be raided, so whoever the guy was that was handling it, guarding it, he took off about 1 o'clock in the morning. About 5 o'clock, just as the sun was coming up, here come this big touring sedan with 6 guys in it. They jumped out and held up all our family, and they had sawed-off shotguns, and they stuck them in the belly of my half-brothers, and they went crazy and everything else, and they were looking for the liquor. And my dad told them there was none here, and they wouldn't believe him, and my mother went to the other end of the house and called the riot squad just as they tore the telephone lines out. I will never forget that. One gangster said, "I think she got through because I heard her talking on the phone." So they said, "We better get the hell out of here. We can't find nothing," one of the guys said. So they took off. And they got in this touring sedan, and they said, "Don't come out of the house." So just to make sure we didn't, they shot at the house with their sawed-off shotguns and sped off and left. That was quite an experience. I was just a little kid wondering what the hell was going on. Now, this anecdote is shared in part in Schiffer's book, but because he doesn't know or care who Paul Morris is, it's not germane to his story, right? He's talking about John, the king of Skid Row. He doesn't share the information about John's godfather on the range being the supplier. It's only because he was kind enough to share this unpublished memoir with me that I was able to make the connection. So we know that Bassage and Mazaran, pioneer range saloon owners now in St. Paul, are involved in distributing moonshine with Paul Morris in the mid-1920s. What does that have to do with Stuart Lake in 1931? And didn't I say that by the time of Stuart Lake, Paul Morris was living in Wisconsin and essentially washed up? Yes, that's true. Paul Morris was almost certainly not involved in the Stuart Lake ring. Well, how did I know to investigate George Bassage and John Mazaran in the first place? You know the old saying, follow the money? Well, when the Minnesota ring was raided at Stuart Lake, who bailed out most of the participants? So, let's circle back to Stuart Lake. Paul Morris may have fallen on hard times, but a former business partner of his hadn't. Meet the second era's major operator and the invisible linchpin of Stuart Lake, Frank Berklich. Quote, "Frank B. was the head moonshiner. He was equivalent to the mafia don, Nobby Valeri. No one went into the moonshine business unless they had his blessing. If they didn't, they were either reported to the feds or their operation was destroyed. He had all the political connections and he took care of the payoffs when it was necessary. He was in on one of the biggest moonshine productions in the state of Minnesota or the whole Northwest as far as that's concerned. I don't know what went wrong, but about 6 months after it went into operation, it was raided and smashed up. Nobby Valeri." If some of you have heard of Frank Berklich, it's possibly because you're related to him, and it's also because following Prohibition and for many years thereafter, he owned and ran the Garden Lounge on Howard Street in Hibbing. When you do this kind of research, you end up sketching ancestry for a lot of people, right? Here's some thumbnail family tree work. Frank Berklich, his first wife, who died young, was Rose Galatz, the sister of Louis Galatz. Frank Berklich marries again. His second wife, Manda, she had been married and widowed too. Her first husband's name, Joe Sikich. Remember him? Died from illness contracted while building his family's house. Their son, Frank Sikich. And Louis Sikich is possibly a cousin related back in the old country, and I haven't been able to firmly establish that yet, but I have reason to believe that. So all of the locals busted at Stuart Lake in the raid are related via Frank Berklich and his wife. They're like the invisible spoke around which these locals revolve. And that makes sense. If you're doing something illegal, keep the circle as tight as possible in your extended family. And here's another wonderful piece of luck. Early on, while trying to locate a picture of Frank Berklich, I came across these images that reinforce the connections between these invisible parties that I've been talking about. These are images that mark an oil deal in Oklahoma in the 1920s, probably. We've got Frank Berklich, Paul Morris, John Mazeron. These guys probably needed a, quote, legitimate place to dump bootlegging money, and risky oil ventures like these may have contributed to Paul Morris's eventual financial downfall. So back to Frank Berklich. Nabi Valeri ties him to Stuart Lake in the quote I read a few minutes ago, calling him the equivalent of a mafia don. How can I be so sure that Berklich was involved in Stuart Lake when he wasn't among those arrested and prosecuted? This brings me back to the beginning of the presentation. Remember when I stumbled upon the family of Louis Galatz and a most important piece of information? It turns out that decades after the bust, Louis Galatz, in cooperation with one of his grandsons, Bill, wrote a brief account of the operation. It's the only description written with a direct participant that exists, and no one outside the immediate family has ever seen it. So who ran the operation locally? Quote, the factory was run by Frank Berklich, who was Louis Galatz's brother-in-law. Another connection. It turns out that Louis Galatz, Paul Morris, Frank Berklich, and Manda Rukavina Sikich, Berklich's second wife, all came from the same town in what's now Croatia, Gospic, which had a population of about 38,000 at the turn of the century. Back to Louis Galatz's story here. The time was March 1931, and Louis was working for Charlie Schubat, driving bus, and for Mike Knezevich, owner of Hibbing Van and Transfer. Louis had heard about big money to be made bootlegging. He told Charlie Schubat, thank you for the job, but went after the big money. Charlie tried to talk him out of it, but when he failed, Louis left with a promise of his job back whenever he wanted to return. Louis's father, George, had lent Charlie Schubat money to start the bus line, unquote. Yet another bus line. This is a whole other thread. Why wasn't Frank Berklich arrested? Well, lucky for him, we find out that he was downtown Hibbing at the time of the raid and so avoided getting picked up. According to Louis Galatz's account, as his brother-in-law, Berklich promised to financially look after Galatz's family while he was away at prison and keeping his mouth shut. Apparently, that didn't happen. Family members say that Louis Galatz was livid, and when he got out of Leavenworth, he went looking for Berklich. So back to Louis's memories. This is crucial. Louis was working mainly as a driver, delivering bootleg whiskey to Fargo, Mr. Kennedy, St. Paul, Tom Banks, and Chicago Heights, Joe Giovanni. A side note, Louis's family told me that many years later, Louis found out that one of his grandkids was going to college in North Dakota, and he got an odd look on his face. They asked him about it, and he said something to the effect that, I could drive that trip with my eyes closed. When pressed, he said that he would have to make that drive to Fargo. Now remember the distance and how primitive the roads were at that time. He would have to make that drive at night with no headlights. That's real moon shining. And we'll see why that precaution was necessary. The account continues. Louis also worked at the factory, doing his share of manufacturing and delivering corn, sugar, etc. While working for Sugar Mike Knezevich, 3 men would come from Chicago to oversee the operation. The deliveries were made in 3 different kinds of trucks. One of these looked like a load of hay, the center of which was hollow. Louis would drive a truck to the delivery point and switch trucks. Money was collected by the drivers. Hijacking was common. Rival gangs would ambush the trucks and beat up, or more often, kill the drivers and steal the whiskey. Louis was hijacked twice. Once outside Rush City, once outside of Fargo. He was shot there. Drivers knew where the factory was, the delivery system and the routes, the delivery sites and the buyers. When you became a driver, you were told if you divulged any information, you or your loved ones would be killed. His family also told me that many years later, Louis was still afraid for his and his family's safety, and that as an elderly man, he would put a hat on top of the sofa in front of the main window in his living room, and then sit in a chair away from the window. So if someone drove by and shot the place up, they'd think they got him sitting on the sofa. And if you've been to the exhibit downstairs, you know that in 1982, Louis Galatz took some of his kids and grandkids out to the Waymeyer farm at Stuart Lake while it was still there and told them about the operation. There's Louis in front of the house. There he is with a couple of his grandkids. There's the house with him standing there. Now figure how you'd have to dig into that basement to put in 3 28-foot stills and all of those vats, judging by the size of the vat that we have down there as a replica. So a question we haven't looked at yet tonight. How could an operation of this scale of Stuart Lake have gone unnoticed by authorities? In his oral history, Bruno Antonelli said that he thought the feds started tracking the sugar going into Hibbing and followed that trail to the distillery. But how could this huge operation, up to 42,000 pounds of sugar and 1,000 pounds of yeast a week, have gone unraided in 3 different locations for nearly 3 years? That brings us back to Prohibition agent Matt Vietila. In researching the exhibit downstairs, I got the sense that Vietila, while feared and disliked, was respected as someone who just did his job and who, as a teetotaler, was a true believer in the cause. There were agents across the nation on the take, but Vietila didn't seem to be one of them. But little cracks started appearing. In a family memoir by J. Robert Beck, we get this story talking about his ancestor who was Mountain Iron's postmaster and who was succeeded in the job by Vietila's son Rudy. Matt Vietila, the treasury agent who lived in Mountain Iron, had managed to become the richest man in town. He was never openly accused of having taken bribes, but it was hard to accept that he had been able to get that rich on only his salary from a government job. His son Rudy was about 25 years old then and had not been able to launch a career during the Depression, so with Matt's help, he got the appointment as postmaster. This was fortunate for my father because Matt was willing to buy the candy and tobacco business to go along with the postmastership and was able to pay cash for it. I remember Dad showing me the handful. I can't remember whether it was 12, 13, or 15 of $100 bills that he had been paid, a sight neither of us had ever seen. I should say, too, that when Louis Galatz got out of Leavenworth, he went back to moonshining on a small scale with his own still. Why is this important? Because of who he said gave him the still. And why? This is Louis' account. Quote, Vietila felt bad because he was paid off by the 3 Chicago men and couldn't warn them of the bust, which was set up by his superior in St. Paul, Mr. Winchester, unquote. I think this is a case where things get a little jumbled up with the distance of time. It makes no sense that the Chicago men would like their own operation to get busted, and there was a Mr. Winchester in the Prohibition Department, but he doesn't seem to be Vietila's supervisor. But remember this tidbit from the newspaper coverage of the raid? M.L. Harney, Northwest Prohibition Administrator, here on a pleasure visit Saturday, accompanied the agents on the raid. So the main man, Martin Harney, who had recently moved from the Twin Cities office to be the head of the Chicago office, trying to take down the big game Chicago mob, and whose brother James Harney was also a Prohibition agent at the Stuart Lake raid, and who would later be killed in the line of duty near Tamarack, the head of the Chicago office just happened to be in town on a pleasure visit and decided to accompany them on the raid at Stuart Lake. It sounds to me like Harney was in town to make sure that the raid with these Chicago connections happened without a hitch and that no one was going to be able to tip them off. And this seems borne out by the witnesses who went before the grand jury. Even though Matt Vietila led the Stuart Lake raid, the biggest of his career, he didn't testify and seemed to be shut out of the proceedings. Other agents testified, but apparently not him. And Louis Galatz's daughters remember when they were young, a tall man coming to their father and saying, if you've got a still, get rid of it, we're coming tomorrow. Now, I should be clear, I'm not trying to smear Matt Vietila. I don't think there's enough information to be definitive here. I'm just following these little clues where they lead. And remember the newspaper story of the Mud Lake Distilling Company sign and the exchange between the distillers and the Fed agents when they knocked on the door? What can we do for you? Nothing. Stay where you are. What can we do for you? Combined with a sign advertising what you're up to does not sound like people who were worried about being busted. And remember the huge loads of sugar and yeast being trucked by Hibbing Van and Transfer? Why did they assume that they weren't in danger of being raided unless they had taken steps to make being raided unlikely? So, to summarize the invisibles so far, there seems to be a structure here. You've got the local guys, who are the worker bees, operating the still and hauling booze to distribution points. You've got guys like Frank Berklich, who oversee the operation and who also demand a piece from any small or medium scale still, or they will turn you in, a kind of confederation of stills. This level has the connections to police and politicians. This operation also very likely had money invested by local businessmen and luminaries looking to make some extra money. Nabi Valeri says about the Stuart Lake operation, quote, "I don't know what went wrong. A few of the boys really took a financial beating on that one. They learned it's better to have a lot of small operations than a big one," unquote. One of these investors might have been Max Gray, whose name lives on in Max Gray Construction. Even though he sold the business many decades ago, it's still called Max Gray Construction. Louis Galatz's daughters said that their father was also angry at Max Gray when he got out of prison. And if we follow the money again, we see that when Caleb Waymeyer, the owner of the Stuart Lake house, needed to get bailed out of prison, Max Gray came to his aid. There are other businessmen and women that could be connected to this, but the point is this level of the operation is not on the books. They're the silent partners who are distinctly removed from culpability. So that's the local level. And then you've got the outside small guys. These moonshine Johnny Appleseeds who are setting up, working, and overseeing these operations all across the Midwest. We saw them all throughout Wisconsin earlier. And finally, you've got the big fish who run and employ the outsiders. And that's where we're heading now. We've got Fargo, Chicago Heights, and the Twin Cities. Fargo, Mr. Kennedy. I've contacted several prohibition historians in the Fargo area, and no one knows of a Mr. Kennedy related to bootlegging in that area. Here's my best guess at the moment. Digging through the Kennedys in Fargo at this time, I came upon a family of Kennedys who run the McCormick Transfer Company. We know from a local perspective that Hibbing Van and Transfer was key to this operation, and it's a pattern in bootlegging in general to use these transfer companies, so it stands to reason that a Fargo transfer business would be just the type of operation they'd need to move booze across the region. Chicago Heights, Joe Giovanni. Chicago Heights, which is south of Chicago, was a distribution center for the Chicago mob. By the time of Stuart Lake, Chicago Heights was fully folded into the main Chicago Capone organization. There's no one that I can find by the name of Joe Giovanni in Chicago Heights at the time, but remember that Louis Galatz is pulling these names out of his head decades later and telling them to a grandson who's transcribing them, right? So there could be some error. But there is a Joe DiGiovanni who was part of the Sam Costello gang in Chicago Heights and was wounded in a famous gangland assassination there in 1938. Another possibility is that the name was written down incorrectly and Louis Galatz was actually saying Joseph Vanni, Joe Giovanni. We already saw that Joseph Vanni, the supervisor of the Minnesota operation, wasn't from Chicago Heights, but he's clearly connected to the Chicago operations, of which Chicago Heights is an important hub, and it makes sense to deliver truckloads of booze not into the center of the city, but to a distribution point 30 miles south. Author Matt Lutzy wrote a great book about the Chicago Heights mob. In it, he describes 3 types of moonshine operations, from 18-hour bathtub gin to 3-day variety, up to a 7-day fermentation. This is his description of the 7-day method. The 7-day method was a natural fermentation process that produced between 30 and 40,000 gallons. These operations were very large and required 2 shifts of men working day and night. Due to their size, these stills were operated on farms or in warehouses. In some instances, stills of this size were placed in the basement of a house with holes cut through the first and second floors to accommodate the still. That sound familiar? So we know that that's a mob pattern that we've seen both at Stuart Lake and in the Wisconsin busts I've touched on. So when the Stuart Lake raid takes place, the Capones are battling their income tax woes. Al Capone had pled guilty back in June of 1931, 2 months before Stuart Lake is raided, to income tax evasion. And in November of 1931, he's sentenced to 11 years in prison. Also in November 1931, Al's brother, Ralph Capone, enters Leavenworth for tax evasion. But he's transferred out before the Stuart Lake guys get there, the day before the big prison break, in fact. Obviously, organized crime continues whatever is happening to the mob's figurehead, right? So how else can we connect Stuart Lake to the Capones? Well, it's a case again of follow the money, and who's bailing them out. While digging in Chicago area papers, I made a connection. There was a bail company called the Grand Central Surety Company that Ralph Capone, Al's brother and right hand, had investment in. It was essentially a bail company / revolving door to get mobsters out of prison. The government started investigating the company and putting pressure on them to cut ties with mobsters. But before that happens, this scene occurs. It's a bail hearing for the 5 men arrested for the huge still near Sherwood, Wisconsin that we talked about. The state and the defense bicker about what are fair bail amounts to set, $2,500, $3,500, or higher. Then, the rep from the Grand Central Surety Company steps forward and presents a treasury certificate worth $250,000. Talk about making a statement. So Ralph Capone's front puts up this outrageous bond, a middle finger to the court, and gets 2 men out of jail. Who? George Potvin and James Vonnie. 10 months later, George will be hard at work cooking booze at Stuart Lake, and James Vonnie will be indicted for the Walker Farm. So for me, that's a pretty good connection. Now, the Twin Cities. Tommy Banks. When talking about the Twin Cities, Louis Galatz names Tom Banks or Tommy Banks, the Irish leader of the Syndicate, one of the 2 main organized crime rackets in Minneapolis, the other being the Combination led by Isidore Blumenfeld, aka Kid Can. So we've already seen, with John Bassage's anecdote about his family being held up at gunpoint, that there's a history of Iron Range moonshine being distributed in the Twin Cities. Do you want a clearer connection to Tommy Banks here? Banks's attorney was a Minneapolis lawyer named A.M. Carey. He was also the front for several of Tommy Banks's businesses and his business partner in others. So he's clearly a mob lawyer. Even his obituary makes that point. When the Stuart Lake bootleggers, okay, these guys from the range and a couple others, go to federal court, who steps in as their attorney to represent a bunch of nobodies from the range? A.M. Carey. Also, the Chicago newspapers in 1931 explicitly connect the Capone organization and Tommy Banks of Minneapolis. This article talks about 4 states that are the Midwest arm of the Capone ring: Illinois, Iowa, South Dakota, and Minnesota. And here's what they say about Banks. The principal distributor for Minnesota, according to the special agents, was Tom Banks, so-called king of the bootleggers in Minneapolis. But let's go down one last Twin Cities rabbit hole. When I looked at the court documents to see who bailed out Joseph Vonnie, remember him? I found these names: Isidore Kvatinitz, Morris Kvatinitz, and Ann Reusner. Who are the Kvatinetzes? Well, St. Paul notoriously had a hands-off policy regarding organized crime for years called the O'Connor policy after one-time chief of police John O'Connor. The gist of it was, St. Paul will be a haven for any kind of person on the lam as long as you pay us bribes and don't commit any crimes here. And it worked fairly well for years, even if it made the Twin Cities a mecca for some of the nation's biggest criminals. But 2 kidnapping cases after the repeal of Prohibition changed that. The kidnapping of William A. Ham, Jr., president of the Ham's Brewing Company, and the kidnapping of Edward G. Bremer, a St. Paul banker whose father was part owner of the Schmidt Brewery. One of the people who laundered ransom money from the Edward Bremer kidnapping and was sentenced to 5 years at Leavenworth, former Illinois Representative John J. Boss McLaughlin, had his bail made by brothers Morris and Isidore Kvatinitz. Who's McLaughlin's attorney at this stage? A.M. Carey. And the year before Stuart Lake, the Kvatinetzes are also bailing out gangster Philip Flippy Scher on trial for the murder of Sam Doc Miller for $25,000. Flippy's attorney? A.M. Carey. Who's Ann Reusner? Well, that took me a little while, but I figured it out. She's a front for her husband, prominent St. Paul bootlegger Morris Reusner. Right-hand man and partner of Leon Gleckman, the head of the most prominent criminal syndicate in St. Paul. So just like Minneapolis had Tommy Banks and Kid Can, St. Paul had Benny Gleeman's consortium and Leon Gleckman's combination. Reusner was also held as a material witness in the other major kidnapping of William A. Ham, Jr. So it was an occupational hazard at this time for gangsters to be kidnapped by other gangsters and ransomed. On September 24th, 1931, only weeks after Stuart Lake is raided, Leon Gleckman is kidnapped, and his partner, Morris Reusner, is contacted for a ransom. 4 years earlier, Morris Reusner had himself been kidnapped. But let's go back to an earlier offense. Just before he was kidnapped, Morris Reusner was out on bond awaiting a prison sentence in Atlanta for his part in a nationwide bootleg syndicate. This ring originated with 2 millionaire bootleggers from Philadelphia who formed 3 companies in Cleveland and arranged for pure grain alcohol from the Superior Industrial Alcohol Plant that was to be denatured, rendered undrinkable for industrial purposes, to be diverted into bootleg channels. The scale of this job was unbelievable. It was a $140 million operation in 1925 dollars. The ring included Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Atlantic City, Detroit, Chicago, and San Francisco. How much liquor was distributed each week? 900,000 gallons. This federal indictment included 112 people, the largest indictment in criminal history in the country up to this point. 66 of the 112 people, more than half, were from Minnesota. 46, including Morris Reusner, from St. Paul, 5 from Minneapolis, and 15 from Duluth. All this is to say that Chicago-based Giovanni is being bailed out for Stuart Lake by 2 brothers who make a point of bailing prominent gangsters involved in murders and high-profile kidnappings, and by a hugely prominent St. Paul bootlegger, Morris Reusner, who had already served a sentence for his part in a nationwide bootleg ring, was affiliated with the underworlds not only of St. Paul, but also Chicago and New York, and would go on to serve a 3-year term in Leavenworth for tax evasion and stolen securities. Oh, and this huge alcohol industrial ring, only 5 of the 112 people named are from Chicago. One of them is a small-timer who ends up serving only 30 days, Jack Green. So when Jack Green comes to Dr. Dumas in 1928 bearing a letter from an old friend who wants to start a large distillery near Deer River, with what I know at the moment, I'd speculate that Morris Reusner is a reasonable candidate for that letter writer. So that's where the story ends for now. There are more leads to track and people to talk to, but we'll likely never know the full details of what happened. I have tried a Freedom of Information Act from the FBI to see if they have any records from the Duluth or St. Paul prohibition offices related to this, and have been so far rebuffed. But it is fun to get mail from the FBI, I guess. But maybe we've learned enough as it is. That said, I fully expect that someone here tonight might be able to tell me something new. So I'd like to thank our curator here at MDC, Elise Freeman, for letting me continue to deep dive into this story. I'd like to thank Donna Johnson, our CEO, for continuing to support our museum work as well. And I'd particularly like to thank the members of the families related to this story, many of whom are here tonight, particularly the Galatz family, for their generosity in sharing their memories and their materials, and I hope I've helped illuminate this event for you in some way. And I'd like to thank all of you for showing up tonight and for continuing to support MDC and local history. I'll give anyone who wants to a chance to escape now, but if you have questions or comments, I'm happy to stick around and listen. Good night, and thanks again.